verses 15 through 21. Exodus 1, 15 through 21. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, she shall live. But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, why have you done this, and allowed the boys to live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
The streets were alive yesterday. The chant rolled through cities like a siren's call. No kings. It was shouted through bullhorns painted on cardboard, sung by voices hoarse with conviction. The air was thick with anxiety and intention and fear and conviction. It wasn't a religious movement. It was civic and human and messy. A crowd born from anger and ache, from the sense that power had forgotten its purpose. Millions moving together, saying what every age must finally say: no one should hold power like a god. They came from everywhere: teachers, veterans, nurses, students, black, brown, white, women, men, and everything in between. Some marched for democracy, and some for safety, and some for simply survival. And not everyone agreed on every point, but all knew the cost of silence. The country reverberated with the sound of courage breaking free. And somewhere in that noise were people of faith. Not up front with microphones, not off to the side with judgment, but just in it. Pastors and rabbis and imams and priests and people who worshiped on Sunday and marched on Saturday. They didn't organize the protest. They didn't name it. They came for the same civic reasons as everyone else: justice, compassion, freedom. And because their faith left them no excuse not to. Because to follow Christ or to honor God by any name is to stand where people are hurting and say with your presence, you matter. Not to convert the crowd, not to stand beside it, and not to claim ownership of the message, but to embody love in public, in front of everyone. That's why I chose the raised fist to represent holy defiance. And I know it makes some people uneasy. It's been the symbol of revolutions and uprisings, of movements that frightened those in power. It's been raised in riots and in prayer, carried by those demanding freedom and those blamed for unrest. It's been painted black, brown, red, and rainbow, each color carrying its own history, its own ache, and its own hope. This is not an appropriation of a symbol. It's a recognition of its truth, that across generations and across movements, the raised fist has meant the same holy thing: the refusal to surrender dignity. And for some, it feels too political. It feels for others that it's too angry, and still for others, too violent. But look closely. The fist is not ready to strike. It's holding on. It's holding on to dignity when the world tries to strip it away. It's holding on to hope when despair feels easier. It's holding on to one another when systems pull us apart. It's the human shape of endurance, the body's way of saying, I will not bow to fear. It's the same posture as prayer. Hands closed, not in anger, but in resolve and reverence. The hand of the midwife catching new life, the hand of Christ overturning tables, the hand that still grips to the promise that love will outlast every empire. And that's why faith belongs in those crowds, not to bless the protest itself, but to bear witness within it. We show up because love is not an idea, it's an action. Because every person in that crowd and in our country bears the image of God, whether they know it or not. Because the love that hides in pews is not love at all. We march to prove that we're different. We do not march to prove that we're different, but we march to prove that we belong to one another. To believe every life has equal worth, that is holy defiance in a world addicted to qualifying a person's value. So this is where our story begins. Long before there were megaphones or slogans, there were two women who stood before a throne in Egypt and dared to live as if God, not Pharaoh, ruled the world. So the story does open in Egypt, but not the Egypt of pyramids and gold, but the Egypt of bricks and sweat. The Hebrews have lived there for generations now, long after Joseph's bones were laid to rest. They've multiplied, built homes, and raised children. What began as a refuge has quietly become captivity. And a new Pharaoh sits on the throne, a man obsessed with control. He doesn't remember Joseph and doesn't care too much about history, only about numbers. Too many Hebrews, he says. They're too strong, too different. Fear becomes his policy. He orders new cities built on the backs of enslaved labor, whose lives were consumed in the making of an empire. But fear is never satisfied. When forced labor doesn't shrink the population, Pharaoh decides to shrink their future instead. He summons the midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. Their names are rare jewels in a text that rarely records women's names. And that tells us that they mattered. They are not nobles or prophets. They are workers, women who move from house to house, answering cries in the night. They carry bowls of water and oil, towels, herbs, prayers. Their hands are calloused, their knees always stained with the dust of a birthing floor. They are witnesses to every new beginning, the first sound of life in a world that sometimes is run by death. Pharaoh gives them a command that chills the air. When a Hebrew woman gives birth, if the child is a boy, kill him, quietly, efficiently. Let the girls live. The logic is cruel but clear. Erase the next generation of strength. No warriors, no leaders, no sons to remember the promises of God. We're not told how long those two women stood there in Pharaoh's presence, before a man who holds their very lives in his hand. He expects obedience. Everyone obeys Pharaoh. His word is law, his image carved into stone. No one tells him no. But Shiphrah and Puah do. Somehow, in that room reeking of incense and threat, they decide, not us, not us. Maybe they exchange a glance, or whatever it is really between them, it's enough. They leave the palace, return to their people, and do their work. The cries of newborns keep echoing through the slave quarters. Pharaoh's decree begins to crumble under the weight of their quiet defiance. And just imagine for a moment what that meant. Every knock on the door could have been soldiers. Every birth could have been their last, but they kept going. One birth, then another, then another. They save lives not once, not twice, but over and over and over again. Resistance measured in heartbeats. When Pharaoh calls them back, demanding an explanation, they meet his gaze and tell him, "The Hebrew women are vigorous." They give birth before we even arrive. It's a lie, yes, but a holy one. They didn't do it to save themselves. They did it to save a nation. The cries of the newborns fill the air where there should have been silence. Two women, nameless to Pharaoh but known to God, become the hinge of history. Because of them, Israel's sons live. Because of them, the story continues. The writer of Exodus pauses here to simply say, and God dealt well with the midwives. It's not a medal ceremony or a monument. It's just divine acknowledgement. The smallest line for the greatest courage. God sees what Pharaoh cannot. The quiet rebellion of women who protected the pulse of creation itself. They didn't defeat the empire. They defied it. And sometimes that's enough to begin liberation. We read their story quickly, as if courage comes easy, but there's nothing easy about this. Shiphrah and Puah didn't know how it would end. They had no assurance that God would deal well with them. They didn't even have a roadmap for what obedience should look like under tyranny. They just had conviction, the quiet, probably trembling kind that chooses to act anyway. They feared God more than a king. Those few words describe a faith more generous than any weapon. Pharaoh's entire empire was built on fear. Fear of him, fear of punishment, fear of scarcity. But the midwives, they feared something higher. They remembered a God who heard the cry of the oppressed, who breathed life into dust. Their reverence reordered reality. Pharaoh might have crowns and armies, but he was not the author of life. That kind of faith always comes with risk. Not theological risk, real, bodily, reputation-breaking, life-altering risk. They could have been executed. Their families could have suffered. They could have lost everything, but they still said no. And that is what makes their defiance holy. It wasn't safe, but it was faithful. Faith isn't a belief you hold on to in your mind. It's a loyalty you live with your life. Real faith always puts you at odds with something. Comfort, convention, control. It asks to trust God enough to let go of the false security of the Pharaoh's approval. It calls us to trade predictability for purpose, and it calls us to risk love in a world that remembers and rewards indifference. The midwives risked because they believed life itself was worth it. Not just their own, but the life of a people, the life of God's promise. And that's where we begin to see the heart of stewardship. Because what they protected was not theirs to keep. It was theirs to care for. They didn't own those children. They midwifed the next chapter of God's story. Their faith preserved the future. So this is where this story this morning questions us. What are we willing to risk so that life can continue? What will we defy in ourselves, in our systems, in our fears, so that love and justice and hope can take their next breath through us? The church was never meant to play it safe. We were meant to act faithfully. But somewhere along the way, we started mistaking safety for wisdom and predictability for peace. We built walls thick enough to keep out danger, but sometimes those walls kept out the Spirit too. God has never done their best work through the cautious. The Red Sea didn't part for a committee. The resurrection didn't wait for a vote. And the Holy Spirit didn't blow because of a well-written mission statement. God's best work has always been about setting things free. God moves when love is set free, when justice is raised up. We are the inheritors of that same story, the story of a God who will not stay boxed in by fear, bureaucracy, or the status quo, but by keep trying to domesticate it, and we call hesitation prudence, and fear good stewardship, and control as discernment. But the gospel was never meant to fit inside our comfort zones, inside our bubbles. Faith that costs us nothing will also change nothing. When the church forgets how to risk, we forget who we are. We were not founded on certainty, but on calling. Fishermen who left nets, prophets who left nations, women who left the safety of silence. Every movement of God has started with someone who dared to trust that obedience to God was worth the unknown. Risk is the language of resurrection. It's how God brings life out of what we thought was finished. And if we believe that, then we can't cling to things that simply keep us alive. We must reach for what makes us alive. Holy defiance isn't just saying no to Pharaoh. It's saying yes to the terrifying freedom of trust. The midwives teach us this. Faith doesn't wait for guarantees. They had no promise of reward, only the conviction that God was worth the danger. What would it look like if the church lived that way again? If we feared missing God's call more than missing our comfort? If we risked reputation for compassion, tradition for truth, and certainty for love? That's where the story turns. When our reverence outweighs fear, when we remember that fear was never supposed to be polite. Holy defiance is not rebellion for its own sake. It's the courage to live as if God still rules, even when Pharaoh's throne is the one that fills the skyline. When we talk about holy risk, it can sound abstract until you realize you're already living it. Every act of faithfulness in this church is an act of defiance against fear. Every time we choose to keep building and keep giving and keep believing the work matters, we are pushing back against the empire of not enough. That's what your giving does. It doesn't just sustain ministry, it multiplies it. It sends pastors and staff out as the hands and the voice of this congregation, into hospital rooms, classrooms, community meetings, and living rooms where the gospel shows up in real time. Their work is your witness, your faith in motion. But even more, your giving keeps this space alive, and not as a monument, but as a mission field. These walls are where children learn courage, where neighbors meet without judgment, where stories of pain find a listening ear. The sanctuary, the classrooms, the fellowship hall, they're not just rooms, they're roots, and it's the anchor where God's love can grow. When we keep this place warm and welcoming, we're not paying bills, we're paying attention. Every light that stays on says to the world, God's people are still here. Every repaired roof, every unlocked door, and every clean floor is a proclamation. This story is not over. And what happens here doesn't stay here. Through our partnerships, through shared meals, through the outreach we fund, our generosity crosses the threshold. It becomes food and relief and advocacy and hope, and most especially, love translated into motion. That's the pulse of a living church. The staff, the building, the mission, they're not separate silos. They're not line items in the budget. It's one body, breathing faith into this city. Your gifts make that heartbeat possible. And that's where our calling meets its next question. What comes after faithfulness? Because holy defiance, that's not a single act. It's a rhythm. The midwives didn't just resist once. They kept showing up. And that's what we're called to do too. To keep showing up, to keep saying yes to what God is birthing. Let's go back to our story one more time. After Shiphrah and Puah defied Pharaoh, after they chose reverence over fear, the story doesn't end with their victory. Pharaoh doubles down. Every Hebrew boy that is born, throw him into the Nile. The decree gets darker, and it gets deeper. And right there, in the shadow of that violence, a mother hides her child in a basket. A sister watches a river. A daughter of Pharaoh draws the basket from the water. And because Shiphrah and Puah, 2 women, once said no, another woman dared to say yes. Because of their quiet defiance, a child named Moses lived. Shiphrah and Puah had no idea what their courage was set in motion. They weren't trying to save a nation. They were just trying to be faithful in the moment that was in front of them. And that was enough for God to change the ending. And that's how God's work still unfolds. We never know what our faithfulness will spark. A meal shared, a check written, a conversation offered in grace instead of judgment, a congregation deciding to give more than it keeps. These are the seeds of liberation. And even when it doesn't quite look like it yet, God recognizes. When Shiphrah and Puah said no to Pharaoh, they weren't just resisting evil, they were making room for life. And that's what we're called to do, to make room for God to move, to be the ones who hold the line, who build the table, who keep the doors open for the next act of grace to walk through the door. This is our holy defiance, to create space where love can breathe. Every act of compassion, every risk that we take for justice, every dollar that fuels mercy instead of fear, it all clears the ground for God's future to take root. So let's live like that. Let's be a church that keeps building when the world says give up. Let's be a people who refuses to let fear have the final word. Let's give and act and dream as if the next Moses might already be floating down the river, waiting for someone brave enough to reach out and pull him to safety. Because Shiphrah and Puah didn't know the story they were starting, and neither do we. And you know what? We don't have to see the ending to begin the work. We just have to make room for God to start. And if we do, if we keep showing up with that kind of courage, that kind of generosity, that kind of stubborn hope, then generations from now, when someone tells the story of this church, our church, they won't say we played it safe. They'll say we made room for life. They'll say we helped deliver the future. Amen.